Hi there, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Tuesday. Tonight, a new Buy Canadian defense plan.
Our national security and our economic security go hand in hand.
Prime Minister Mark Carney announces a long-awaited defense industrial strategy with a major push towards Canadian investment and a pull away from U.S. reliance. I'll go one-on-one with the minister in charge of implementing the plan, Melanie Joly, in moments. Then, an eye on inflation.
He promised that he would be judged by the prices at the grocery store, and here we are a year later, and those prices are rising at a world-leading rate.
Canada's annual inflation rate slowed slightly last month, but food prices keep going up and up and up. We're going to break down the state of Canada's economy and what it all means for your pocketbook with former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz. He'll be here with me live in studio coming up. Plus, a trade war hissy fit?
I don't call it hissy fit. What I call is making sure we communicate with the American people.
Well, he speaks for himself, and I speak for the party.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford claps back at Conservative MP Jamil Jivani, saying Canadians are having a hissy fit over a trade war with the United States. And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says Jivani speaks for himself. Our front bench panel will be here in a little bit to talk about all of that. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. First, though.
Over the last few decades, Canada has neither spent enough on our defense nor invested enough in our defense industries. We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us. And this has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford and dependencies that we can no longer sustain. This strategic autonomy doesn't mean isolation. It means being strong enough to be a partner of choice rather than a dependent. It means building a domestic defense industrial base so we are never hostage to the decisions of others when it comes to our security.
We should all agree that Canada needs to become militarily independent, and that includes not just having a strong armed forces, but the ability to supply that armed forces with the best technology and equipment that exists in the world. We have too much bureaucracy. Everyone agrees on that. Mr. Carney's solution: create more bureaucracy. His new proposal adds 6 new bureaucracies, agencies, councils, units, and other bureaucracies that will actually gum up and slow the system down.
Prime Minister Mark Carney there, and then reaction from Pierre Poilievre, the Prime Minister unveiling a long-awaited multi-billion-dollar defense industrial strategy that bets big on building at home. As Canada seeks to reduce its reliance on the United States, the federal government is trying to boost the amount of military equipment it buys domestically. The $6.6 billion strategy promises over the course of a decade to boost the share of defense contracts awarded to Canadian companies to 70% from the current 43%, to double Canada's defense exports and create 125,000 new jobs. Federal Industry Minister Melanie Joly will be in charge of implementing the new policy. Hi, Minister Joly. Pleasure to welcome you back to the show. As always, thanks for making the time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hi, Vashi.
In announcing this plan today, the Prime Minister said that it'll create 125,000 new jobs over the next decade. How do you know that?
Well, because first and foremost, we know that by investing even more in defense and in companies in Canada, we can grow the revenues, and by growing the revenues, they will be able to hire and we will be able to create more jobs. So right now, if you look at first thing first, how many contracts by the Canadian Armed Forces are given to Canadian companies, we're at 42%. That's quite low. Our goal is to nearly double it to get to 70%. And we know that we will be increasing by doing that, not only our capacity to have a defense sector, but also our capacity to even sell it to the Canadian Armed Forces and also to export. So the growth in terms of revenues for the defense industrial sector will be growing by 220%. So that's why, based on all these different calculus, we get to 125,000 jobs.
So I understand in theory certainly exactly what you just laid out, right? The idea is to boost the share of defense contracts going to Canadian companies, in turn create a bigger export base as well, and then boost the revenues of that industrial base. But my question is, like, how you know for sure that will happen? Because in the briefing, for example, that was provided by officials, there is nothing, no target set in the interim, right? It's just this will happen over a decade or by the end of a decade. There aren't really any specifics by which Canadians can hold your government accountable along the way. So how do you know for sure, and how will we know in turn that this is happening?
So what is clear is how much we will be investing in our Canadian Armed Forces and how much we'll be investing in defense. Of course, we're targeting 2% this year of all of our GDP in defense. So, and over the next 5 years, we know that that's going to be $80 billion at least, and that's $16.5 billion per year. That's pretty much 3 times the national daycare program. It's a lot of investment. And so we think that only in the next year, we will be launching procurements that are really, really important. And this is led by the Secretary of State for Defense Procurement, Stephen Fuhr. But it is 12 submarines. It is 15 river-class destroyers. This is 6 polar icebreakers. This is 2 major icebreakers. This is a major space communication contract. This is another contract also for ammunitions. And also, of course, we're talking about everything linked to the fighter jets contract and also for the training and simulation. That is only in the next year. So it shows how much these are different opportunities for Canadian companies, and not only that, but for the workers and also for those working in the sectors that are tariffs. Steel, aluminum, even auto sector. All these workers can benefit from not only these investments, but protecting their jobs, and also we think we can create new jobs.
And I wouldn't take away from your government's intent, and I think Canadians understand it very clearly. But intent isn't always the same thing as execution, and I would say particularly in the defense industrial space. And I'll point to a couple of the examples that you just provided. When you talk about submarines, there had been indications from the government that a decision could be taken perhaps even by the end of the year. The F-35 review was supposed to be completed by the end of the summer, and it still hasn't materialized. This industrial policy, your government also indicated would be completed by the end of last year, and here we are, 6 weeks past that deadline. There are many examples throughout this government, the past government, and the one before it where planned defense spending didn't actually materialize, particularly in the area of procurement. Why should Canadians be convinced that this time is any different?
So I understand the impatience, I really, really do. But I think, meanwhile, when we're talking to people in the industry, they're saying, "Wow, you were able to come up with a new defense industrial strategy within, a year." And actually, we did it in nearly 7 months. This is an entire culture change, and this is the first time Canada has a defense industrial strategy. So good news. At the same time, we didn't stop. We didn't wait. Meanwhile, we signed a new SAFE agreement, which is basically a partnership with European countries, and we're the only non-European countries to have access to defense procurement in Europe. First. Second, we signed a contract with Bombardier for 6 new aircraft. Third, we came up with a new partnership with the European Space Agency of $500 million. We just also came up with the BDC having $4 billion in capital to invest across the country in companies that will be in the defense sector. This is a major undertaking. Of course, I understand the impatience. I understand your impatience asking me the questions, and I'm as impatient as you, but I really think that things are moving ahead.
I want to talk about sort of one factor about how they will move ahead, if I may, Minister, and that's around when you talk about boosting the export capacity of the defense industrial base here. And in particular, a question the Prime Minister got today that I listened to with great interest about where those exports may go in order to achieve some of the targets that you've set. The Prime Minister was asked if it meant a different posture than the previous government you were a part of about shipping weapons to countries which are not our allies. He said the short answer is yes, but that there would be guardrails. What are those guardrails?
Well, our human rights policy remains. It's been the guiding principle of many governments beforehand, and we will continue to make sure that we have that lens. At the same time, the reality when you look at the defense industry in Canada, well, for many years, a lot of the companies from CAE to Rochelle, etc., have been saying, well, we're able to get and win contracts in more countries, and it's easier for us to actually find contracts in countries than actually get contracts from our government, which doesn't make sense because these are Canadian companies. And so we know that they're already really good at exporting. We've been exporting planes, we've been exporting also a lot of our training and simulation expertise across the world, but we know that we can help also these companies at home. So we will be able to increase the exports through, of course, the European Union. I just talked about the SAFE agreement we signed. There's a lot of interest also from Asian countries as well, Japan, Korea for sure, and that's our mode in which we're operating.
If these companies, though, are telling you, Minister, with respect that it's easier to sell elsewhere than here in Canada, why should they, and again by extension Canadians, trust the Liberals that ran a government for 10 years, that created that situation, to then fix it?
Well, we're in a new world now. We know that there's a new geopolitics that we don't control, but we know also that all NATO countries are now increasing their investments in defense. We would all need to get to 2% by the end of the year. We all need to increase to actually 5% by 2035. So that's the goal. We're doing our part, and while investing $500 billion by 2035, we will also take care of our own, and we will also invest in us. And so that's why we're creating all of these jobs, and at the same time, we will equip our Canadian Armed Forces that really need to be well supported.
What happens if the geopolitical imperative changes with the midterms, for example, or with the next election in the United States? Like, how can, again, Canadians be assured that once the sort of de facto situation or the status quo goes back to what it was, that the things that should have been obvious to Liberals back then will remain obvious to Liberals now?
So I won't answer an hypothetical question of what will happen in the next months. You and I don't know. One thing is clear is unpredictability and chaos there's really good chances that will continue. That was the entire point of the Prime Minister's speech in Davos, which was saying to middle powers, let's work together to counter political hegemony, hyperscalers, so basically the tech giants, and at the same time American protectionism. So our goal is not only to look and be wait and see mode. In 2025, we're a lot in reaction mode. In 2026, we have a plan and we're putting it into place. And our goal is to make sure that we're investing this important amount of money in our defense sector. We are doing it first and foremost because of us. Second, we're doing at a time because geopolitics is much more chaotic, and at the same time, there's a trade war happening. So we have an over-dependency over the U.S. that we need to be able to change, and we're making sure that we're going to be in a position of force, and we will be able also to create all these jobs. So we're using investments in defense, of course, for a strong man and woman, but also as an important economic stimulus to be able to protect the sectors affected by the tariffs and also to create new jobs in advanced manufacturing and also in sectors that are very much linked to a lot of research and development. So this is win-win, actually, for Canadians.
I'll end sort of where I started, in that everything you just described, again, I think is very welcome news for Canadians, and they would like to believe that it will come to fruition. Will your government be transparent along the way about where you are and where you aren't in nearing those objectives? Because so far there's been no disclosure about the specific targets over the next 10 years, just what you want at the end of the decade.
Well, I would counter what you're saying by saying that if anyone reads the Defense Industrial Strategy paper, all the objectives are there. And I've mentioned then 125,000 jobs, 50% of increase in export, an increase of 2020. but that's over 10 years, of course. And we now have a new Defense Investment Agency, which has somebody in charge of it, which is Doug Guzman and his team, making sure that finally we go ahead faster with procurement, and finally we can give predictability to Canadian companies, and Canadian forces will be able to get their equipment faster. And we have a Secretary of State for Defense Procurement that his job is actually make sure to make that happen. And so we have this entire plan. Things are moving ahead, and for the rest, it will be a pleasure to answer all your questions to provide more transparency.
We'll do lots of interviews over the next decade, I guess. Thanks, Minister. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure.
That's Federal Industry Minister Melanie Joly. And just last hour, in the last hour, I should say, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Federal Conservatives, took to the microphone up on Parliament Hill to sound off about new data around inflation, most specifically food prices at grocery stores. That new data shows that the overall inflation rate has edged down slightly for the month of January, but that food prices are still jumping 4.8%, in fact, for the same month. Have a listen to what Pierre Poilievre said.
This morning, we got some terrible news from Statistics Canada that food price inflation has now hit a spectacular 7.3%, by far the worst in the G7, twice what it is in the United States, and twice what it was when Mr. Carney took office. He promised that he would be judged by the prices at the grocery store, and here we are a year later, and those prices are rising at a world-leading rate.
We're set to talk about the politics of that a little bit later on in the show. First, though, after a short break, we'll take a deeper dive into the economics of the rate of inflation and more largely the state of the Canadian economy. Former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz is my next guest right here in studio. There he is. We're back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back to Power Play on this Tuesday. New data from Statistics Canada today shows overall inflation continues to edge down, largely driven by a decline in the cost of gasoline. But food prices at the grocery store continue to rise. The overall rate, now stands at 2.3%, down from 2.4% in December. Analysts had expected that rate to hold steady. And as I mentioned, I think just before the commercial break, food prices were up 4.8% in the month of January. Former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz is here. Mr. Poloz is a special advisor at Osler, Hoskins and Harcourt. Hi, Mr. Poloz. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Thank you very much for making the time. I wanted to start off on that overall headline inflation number.
Yeah.
What is your read on it? Feels like it's in a better place than it has been. Maybe?
Yeah, I would describe the report as a benign report, which is, in a way, good news because you're in a context where we're worried about some upside risks on inflation coming from the tariff disruptions to trade and how companies adjust to those things. I think those risks remain, but it's in that sense, it is a positive outcome that we're still where we were or even a touch lower. But underlying inflation, I think, is still in that sort of 2.4, possibly 2.5 or 2.3. It doesn't really matter. That's not a horrible place to be. And what we're seeing is plenty of evidence that the economy has still got excess capacity and probably a little bit more excess capacity as we go forward.
What does that mean in layman's terms?
Well, that means that there's slack in the economy. We've got jobs being lost in some of the targeted industries. We're going to see some jobs being lost in the public service and so on. So there's some downward pressure on inflation that comes from that slack in the labor market. And it's modest, but it's still present, and it's likely to give this general tendency for the inflation to edge lower unless something goes wrong. And something that goes wrong might be an uptick because of the trade disruption or something like that.
What does that mean, do you think, moving forward for interest rates?
Well, I think we're in that, it's even more complicated than I just said from that point of view, because some of the slack would be labeled as structural, that is coming from the change in the trading world that we live in. And that's a sort of shock to the economy that interest rates can't really address. If you've seen the Bank of Canada be pretty clear about that. And in fact, a large share of the job losses we've seen are in those sectors that are the Trump's targets. And so what that means then is there's not much that one can do about that except do the kinds of things that the government's announcing, like around defense procurement and those kinds of things to create jobs in other areas, or perhaps jobs from other areas that impact, say, steel or aluminum, those kinds of things. So I think in the end, those structural things take more time. The context you're thinking of, though, is like uncertainty is so high. Yeah. Investment is very weak. Household spending is not that strong. In fact, consumer confidence is kind of at recession levels. And so we're in a place where the economy doesn't have a lot of pep, in that situation, and downside risks can show up at any time. So in that context, inflation should be easing lower. But do interest rates come in to kind of correct that? That's much less likely when those structural issues are happening. At a point in time, you won't know which is dominant, but we'll know if inflation continues to fall, that means that the gap, or as we call it, or the excess capacity is actually increasing.
I have more questions about the structural issues, but I did want to ask one more question about inflation.
Yeah.
And not for you to weigh in the politics, but it is a politically contentious subject.
Sure.
And it is actually, I think, something that matters a lot to people, and that is the cost of food, right? Which, keeps outpacing the headline number that we're looking at quite substantially in the past few months, for example. What is going on there, in your view?
Well, those numbers are, of course, being affected by the tariffs that were put in place in a number of food areas. They're also being affected by the taxation effect that came through, which was, the tax holiday and then the reversal of the tax holiday. But I think the big thing is that the whole food sector is suffering from a variety of what we call special shocks, such as the prolonged drought that we've had in Western Canada and the United States, unfortunate weather in other parts that, just sound like special things. Well, they affect prices, and it could take a whole year for those, or more, perhaps, for beef, for example. It could be a very long cycle for beef to recover from a prolonged drought that we've had. And that especially affects, as you know well, like not just home, groceries from the grocery store, but also restaurant meals. And so you kind of have this broad swath of costs that are rising all at the same time. And certainly it's got nothing to do with the cycle in the economy or anything. That's why when we look at inflation, we usually talk about, core inflation, or something that excludes gasoline or energy and food, because those are things we really have no control over. And if we do that, we kind of get to that 2.4% area, which suggests inflation is just a little higher than we'd like it to be, but not really significantly so.
When you look out over the near term to midterm, and in particular around the degree to which uncertainty with the United States has impacted things that you mentioned, like inflation, investment, growth, things of that nature. We have this sort of thing hanging over us over the next 6 months to a year around the review of CUSMA. The bank has obviously referenced some of the uncertainty that creates. How do you think it will translate, in particular, to growth or lack thereof?
So I think the economy, most economists have sort of settled in on around a 1% growth track, which is kind of a resilient but not great growth track. I would say to that, I'd add another downside risk, which is that oil prices, we used to think of 80-ish, and now we think 60-ish. Well, that's 3 to 4% of our economy, with a headline reduction in revenue growth of something like 20 to 25%. So it can take 1 percentage point off of economic growth right there. So I kind of think 0-ish is more our track. But anyway, somewhere between 0 and 1 seems to be where we are. And that just means that you're in a place where at any point, anything that's negative is going to throw you off into recession. Now, on the other side of that balance sheet is, of course, initiatives that the government is taking, which we can't really estimate how quickly they're going to come in, as you were just talking about just a moment ago. Well, but we do have the GST credit went up. That's going to impact right away. Some of the defense spending is immediate. So there are some things that are actually going to be offsets in that picture, but very hard to time or measure. So I think that just underscores that we really are in this kind of in-between space, gray zone, which the bank has called, risk management zone. There's no clear trajectory one way or the other, and you're going to have to see the data to decide what's next.
Do you think a resolve, should there be one, and obviously, best case scenario, there is some sort of resolve, even if it isn't the perfect deal, but just an actual deal that both parties say, you know, we want to endorse. Do you think that that will actually provide the kind of certainty to change that trajectory, given the evidence of, you know, the fact that the deal existed before and it didn't mean that much? Like, will it actually create certainty is my question.
I'm a little reluctant to stick my neck out on that. I certainly think it's bound to reduce uncertainty. And for sure, if you're in a sector that has not been highlighted as one of the president's target areas or in a related sector, then I think having CUSMA restored or, you know, ready to keep on going would make a big difference to a lot of companies. And companies that for right now have been operating under CUSMA like that. So everything's been going okay, but of course the uncertainty is kind of killing them and they're holding back on investments. So I think there's going to be some unleashing of animal spirits when there is certainty, even if it remains uncertain in those, let's call them strategic sectors that the president always highlights. And I'd like to remind people that the list of things that he cares most about add up to about 2% of our economy, which is not zero. That's a pretty big number in any day. And yet we do know that the capability of Canada to replace up to 2% is right there. Okay, just the critical minerals business, the defense procurement, you're talking about 100,000 or more jobs. You know, that's meaningful in that impact space. The energy plan that Ontario's putting in place. Those are a lot of jobs that will be created. And so we have to bear in mind that there are things going on that will allow companies to pivot, certainly employees to pivot.
Okay. I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot, Mr. Polas. Appreciate the analysis as always.
My pleasure.
Stephen Polas is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. We'll take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, we've got brand new comments from Ontario's Premier Doug Ford and federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre about Conservative MP Jamil Javani's trip to Washington and some of the comments he's made to characterize Canada's view of the U.S. He called it a hissy fit over the issue of trade. Our front bench will be here momentarily to talk about that. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. There they are. We're back in just a moment.
Well, he speaks for himself, and I speak for the party.
Do you think his trip to Washington was helpful to Canada?
Well, my view is that he represents a riding that has been disproportionately impacted by the dispute. He's from just outside of Oshawa. 1,200 Ottawa-Oshawa residents have lost their jobs, in part due to the tariffs. And I think that it's necessary for all MPs to use all the connections and work that they can in order to overturn the tariffs and protect Canadian jobs.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre there reacting to recent comments from Jamil Javani, one of his own MPs, who said Canada is shooting itself in the foot with how it's handling relations with the U.S. In an interview with SiriusXM's Breitbart News Saturday, Javani said Canadians are harming themselves with a, quote, anti-American hissy fit on trade. Ontario Premier Doug Ford fired back at those comments today.
I really don't care what he says about me because I gave him the chance. No one would even know who Jamil Javani was unless I hired the guy in my office. I didn't know him from a hole in the ground, but in saying that, I am happy that he went down to the U.S. I'm happy when I see other premiers go down to the U.S. and lobby. But no, I don't call it a hissy fit. What I call is making sure we communicate with the American people like I just did half an hour ago with the former governor, and continue advocating to our American friends that as we get closer to this CUSMA deal, that our voice is being heard in the U.S.
Mr. Javani just returned from a solo trade mission to Washington, where he says he met with U.S. President Donald Trump, longtime friend Vice President J.D. Vance, and other top officials in the Trump administration. After returning, he met with the minister overseeing trade with the U.S., Dominic LeBlanc, and LeBlanc's office called the meeting productive at the time. So what does our front bench panel make of Javani's post-trip comments and both Mr. Poilievre and Premier Ford's reaction to them? Let's bring the panel in. Dan Moulton is a former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Delta McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. Kathleen Monk is former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. And Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Laura, I'll start with you because it was you who asked Premier Ford that question. What do you make of how Mr. Poilievre and the Premier are responding to this today?
Well, look, I mean, clearly in the Ford comments, there's no love lost between those political figures. They have a long history together, and as you'll recall, Jamil Jivani gave a blistering interview on election night, essentially blaming Doug Ford for the Conservatives' loss. And he's also criticized their COVID era education policies. But look, I mean, I think the big question coming out of this trip and the comments to Breitbart were, who does Jamil Jivani speak for? And I think it was important and notable that Pierre Poilievre came out today and said bluntly, he speaks for himself and I speak for the party. So I think there were a lot of questions here about whether Mr. Poilievre would respond, whether this is a challenge to his leadership from a member of his caucus, and whether there's some mixed messaging going on the Conservatives' position on Canada-U.S. relations, and that has been a perceived weakness for the Conservative Party. So he obviously came out today knowing he was going to be asked about this. I guess the question coming out of it is, do we see further challenges from Mr. Jivani, further trips or comments he makes that seemingly challenge Mr. Poilievre and what he's going to do about it? But clearly, these two leaders have had, certainly on the Premier Ford's part, have had a negative experience with Mr. Jivani. Poilievre did defend him somewhat in terms of representing his constituents, but it sort of feels like this is not the end of the story of Mr. Jivani's kind of comments and outbursts, you could call it, and whether he's going to take attention away from Mr. Poilievre and his positions as the leader of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I think Laura's right, Kathleen, that it is notable that Mr. Poilievre did say, like, he speaks for himself, I speak for the party. I think part of the reason why a question to Mr. Poilievre on this was so anticipated is, A, we haven't heard from him since Mr. Jivani returned, but also right before the trip, he gave his speech at the Conservative convention where he, resoundingly passed his leadership review. But one of the standouts for people who weren't inside the room was certainly the absence of the name Trump or much talk about his position on Trump. I saw recently, he's giving a talk, I think it is in a few weeks, very much like the name of the topic somebody flagged to me is Canada-U.S. relations. But the questions come at a time, I think, where there are bigger questions about how Mr. Poilievre will navigate the issue moving forward.
Yeah, it's not an easy day for Mr. Poilievre. Wounded leadership already with some caucus leaks and other things that were happening. But really, when Jamil Jivani went to Washington, he was auditioning. But to be clear, he was not auditioning for Prime Minister Carney's job. He's actually auditioning to be the opposition leader. And that's why you saw Pierre Poilievre come out so forcefully today. And no leader ever wants to say those words, I speak for the party, because it undercuts their authority, right? That's happened to all party leaders on different, more fringe issues in the past. And so, what Jamil Jivani was doing when he went down to Washington to do that trip was personal brand building. It wasn't statecraft of any sort. And it does end up kind of undercutting his own leader. And I got to say, when he comes out with a statement like, stop with the hissy fit Canadians and start dealing with America, I have to ask myself, what demographic is Mr. Jivani trying to appeal to, and how does it widen his party's voter base? Because I think of all of the women and men of all ages that have taken small sacrifices or large ones in terms of losing their jobs, or smaller ones, just things like, giving up their sweet potatoes because they come from the States, or quarts of raspberries that were grown in the U.S. Like all of those people, he is just alienated by telling them that they are basically having a hissy fit. So he may become leader one day, Mr. Jivani, but it will be of a rump party.
Shakir, it's interesting also because in the wake of the visit, and particularly the meeting with Dominic LeBlanc, where the minister called it a productive meeting, there was actually not a lot of blowback. It was like, oh, he went. He seems to have articulated the Canadian position. He did get meetings with, very high up people in the administration. And then the more interviews, and in particular this interview, the way in which he characterized the Canadian attitude as a hissy fit seems to have what's really led to a more pronounced reaction.
Yeah, I think Jamil's done a good job of getting coverage for sure, but I think it's been for all the wrong reasons. I mean, you mentioned his connection of getting these meetings in Washington. Of course, he's going to get good meetings. He's very close with J.D. Vance. That's going to open a lot of doors for you. You know, meet with the relevant people and whatnot. I would love to see a readout of those meetings and what was discussed and the response and just kind of the positioning there, if that were possible. But I think what's been missing for me, and I think you touched on it briefly with Kathleen, it's just I haven't really seen Pierre. Did he empower Jamil to kind of go and do this? Because I haven't really seen him proactively endorse this in any capacity in any way. And everything I've heard from Jamil since he's come back here, it's really been an I, me, and what I've achieved, not tying it into the broader Conservative Party, and really not tying it into the leader. So that's left me a little bit of head scratching. I think if you're OLO or even just a supporter of the Conservative Party, I think at a certain point you have to ask yourself, when does him going to Washington go from being very helpful to us to kind of being, kind of hurtful to the leader and then even the party generally speaking? I think when you talk about his hissy fit comment, I haven't seen any objective observer of the larger Canada-U.S. relationship that thinks Canada is a problem, that thinks Canada is causing any obstacles. And so that even left me like scratching my head about how does he draw that conclusion? And to Kathleen's point, really, who is he? What audience is he playing to in this context? Just really bad at reading the room, to be quite honest with you. I think the last point I would make here is just the rub off that it would have on Pierre Poilievre. I think common knowledge is just that the main reason why Pierre lost that last election is that most Canadian voters just said, you know what, we do believe Mark Carney is better at handling Donald Trump in Canada and U.S., rightly or wrongly, and that really, had Pierre's numbers plunge. It doesn't help your brand to have your MP go to Washington, come back to Canada, and give Canadians a public scolding about why we're the issue in this dynamic. It doesn't do well for Pierre moving forward or of the party and kind of a tougher follow of the day for Canadians. So I don't know, just I think really poorly played. As he does more interviews, as he does more talking, as he does more engagements, I think just really poorly played in terms of public communication.
Last word to you, Dan.
Well, Vash, it doesn't seem like the Conservatives are missing many opportunities to score on their own net in the court of public opinion at the moment. I mean, I don't think Mr. Poilievre's response today was strong enough. I think he had an opportunity there to reject the idea that Canada is at fault in this moment, in this crisis with the United States, and take, I think, yet another opportunity to prove that he is up to the challenge of dealing with Donald Trump and standing up for Canada in this moment. Mr. Giovanni as well, I mean, to come back from D.C. and make those comments that accuse Canada of undertaking a hissy fit right now completely undermined the entire trip. I think there's a world in which his visit to D.C. and the meeting with J.D. Vance could have been marketed as a win for not just him, but for his party and for his leader. And then he's completely undermined the entire thing with these unwise comments on a far-right American news publication over the weekend. So, it just seems like a consistent trend here where the Conservatives are sort of awry and off message. We saw this just late last week as well with the Conservative MP going public that he was admonished at a caucus meeting for refusing the MP pay increase. So you've got these MPs in the Conservative caucus who are just out there freelancing, doing their own thing right now. And it just seems like a consistent narrative that undermines Mr. Poilievre's leadership. And I think is highlighted through public opinion polling that the Conservatives are just in this position of weakness, looking like the ongoing losers of Canadian politics in this moment.
I think Mr. Poilievre in that press conference was asked, Laura, you can correct me if I'm wrong, how things were in caucus, alluding to some of what you discussed. And I think he either said, good or whatever, but he said overall. Like the qualifier at the end was overall. So take that for what it is. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We've got more of the front bench after that break. Stay right there.
You know who is not one of my guests tonight? That's Texas State Representative James Tallarico. He was supposed to be here, but we were told in no uncertain terms by our network's lawyers, who called us directly, that we could not have him on the broadcast. Then I was told in some uncertain terms that not only could I not have him on, I could not mention me not having him on. And because my network clearly doesn't want us to talk about this, let's talk about this.
Stunning statement from Late Show host Stephen Colbert last night over CBS's decision to pull his interview with a Texas Democrat, at least according to him. Colbert blasted his own network for refusing to air his sit-down with Democratic Senate candidate James Tallarico after pressure tied to the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC recently issued new guidance about a regulation which requires stations to give equal airtime to all candidates in any political race. Talk shows have long been exempted from that rule, but last month the Trump-appointed head of the FCC signaled the agency could now go after late-night talk show hosts motivated by what he called partisan purposes. The front bench is back. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone to talk about that. Kathleen, what's your read on this?
Oh, it's so interesting. I mean, what is Trump's obsession with these late-night entertainment shows? And the answer is simply swing voters still watch entertainment. Sure, the hardcore voters that watch your show, Vashi, they watch the news shows, the political shows, those voters are generally locked in. But it's those swing voters in an election year that politicians and political parties are so after. And so it's interesting to me that they put this pressure, this corporate pressure on CBS to not let the potential upcoming Senator James Tallarico, sorry, I can't say his last name, my apologies, being on the show, because essentially that they are worried about what is going to happen in the Senate. There's a very hard path for the Democrats to take Congress, an even harder path, but made easier for the Senate by new candidates in Alaska and in also Texas. And so it's interesting for me to watch the corporate obedience that comes, because the entertainment shows are such an important place where politicians can get a persuasive message out and actually shape the political landscape.
Yeah, the corporate obedience is one thing. The other thing is if they thought that they were going to, ruin his chances, I feel like the attention on all this might have done the converse, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at what point are we going to start seeing media conglomerates and other parts of civil society start pushing back on some of this? Because, this is not going to be the end of it. The Trump administration is going to continue to weaponize all the instruments of the state that it can to try and interfere in the midterm elections. They're not just signaling this here, they're saying it publicly and consistently, that they intend to use all the voter suppression tactics they can and all of the instruments of the state that they have at their disposal to try and reduce the number of people who are able to cast ballots for the opposing side in the upcoming election. They're making no secret of it. And, this is a worrying trend in American politics. I think Canadian viewers are consistently seeing more and more evidence of it south of the border. And I think, moments like these, we're all very grateful to be Canadian.
I think Dan's right to point to, looking ahead to the midterms, the prospect. I mean, there's so much out in the open, Shakir, about what Trump said, but I think utilizing tools that are now, more respondent to him or responding more to him and his administration is definitely a distinct possibility. And that's probably putting it lightly.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think he's not being quiet about it, whether it was the gerrymandering stuff earlier this year, whether we're seeing right now with, kind of censoring kind of the political views or opponents he doesn't want to have on platforms. He's not hiding his intentions here. And I think that is what's deeply concerning. And I think if you look over the past, since the middle of last year, Democrats have been, outperforming, overperforming their Republican opponents, in special elections and whatnot. They're really increasing their vote share in ridings in states, in districts where, Trump won in 2024, for example. I believe Louisiana was one of them. You're seeing Democrats flip those votes and winning by double-digit margins as well. So if I was a Trump administration, I'd be concerned as well. I mean, I wouldn't use and weaponize the tools that he's using, but I think it comes down to the fact that stop pursuing unpopular policies. You were elected on really a mandate of one, immigration for sure, but two, the economy. And the economy in the U.S. is not doing so well. So I think, if Donald Trump and his team want to correct what's going on here, it's a very simple thing of stop pursuing unpopular policies and start doing things that voters actually want you to do moving forward. Or there's going to be, a price to pay come the midterms. And I think connecting to the Canadian context, that might bode well for us as we pursue, our coups and our negotiations. A weaker president is probably better for Canada.
It sounds, Laura, logical. It sounds like it makes sense. Stop doing unpopular policies that negatively impact people. But my sense is Trump would way rather lean on the FCC than he would say, I'm rolling back tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, there's an unhinged quality to all this, right? I mean, I agree with my fellow panelists that you know that he might be thinking ahead to the political repercussions of having this person on, but it also just speaks to his character, right? He's so sensitive and arrogant. That he worries about someone saying a negative thing about him on television. I think that kind of just speaks to the base elements of who Trump is. And so, yes, there's political consequences from all of this, maybe that they're trying to stemmy. But I think it also just speaks to, like, he doesn't want anyone to be mean to him on TV, and he's going to pursue every avenue in order to prevent that. But I mean, nothing drives more eyeballs than to something by saying that you can't watch it, right? And it was brilliant of Colbert to do that. Of course, he's leaving his post in a couple of months, so I guess he has nothing left to lose. But I think clearly this had the opposite effect than what the Trump administration had intended.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the discussion. As always, our front bench, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. We'll take a quick break. Our takeaway is next.
Over the last few decades, Canada has neither spent enough on our defense nor invested enough in our defense industries. We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us. And this has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford and dependencies that we can no longer sustain. This strategic autonomy doesn't mean isolation. It means being strong enough to be a partner of choice rather than a dependent. It means building a domestic defense industrial base so we are never hostage to the decisions of others when it comes to our security.
We should all agree that Canada needs to become militarily independent, and that includes not just having a strong armed forces, but the ability to supply that armed forces with the best technology and equipment that exists in the world. We have too much bureaucracy. Everyone agrees on that. Mr. Carney's solution: create more bureaucracy. His new proposal adds 6 new bureaucracies, agencies, councils, units, and other bureaucracies that will actually gum up and slow the system down.
Prime Minister Mark Carney making the announcement about a new defense industrial policy for Canada, and reaction there from federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. The policy aims to do a number of things over the next decade. First of all, create 125,000 new jobs, according to the federal government, increase defense exports by 50%, and boost Canadian defense industry revenues by 240%. They also, as you heard from Melanie Joly, the Minister of Industry, earlier on in the program, say that over the next 10 years, the aim is to move the number of defense contracts awarded to Canadian companies from 43%, current level of 43%, to 70%. Once again, though, all of this is made to happen over the next 10 years. The objective is for those goals to be met in 10 years. I asked the minister on multiple occasions whether there would be interim targets or the disclosure, at least, of where the government is on that path. And she did not provide a specific answer on that front, though she said she would be willing to take questions along the way. I'm going to leave our program Power Play there. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Vashi Kapelos. We'll see you at same time, same place tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.